Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome, a very warm welcome to this morning's session. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you this morning and reflect on the kinds of changes that we need to see. Because here we are, in person, in the midst of a global crisis. And I don't mean a pandemic, I mean a global crisis in all its manifestations. In its forms in environmental, social, political, economic. A global crisis in our ability to live in tune with reality. A global crisis in our relationship with the natural world. A global crisis in its all-embracing moment of truth. When we look back on human history, we see that every culture organizes itself around a fundamental story, a creation story. And the purpose of this story is to help people reflect and find answers to the fundamental questions. Questions such as, who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? How should we live? What's the meaning and purpose of life? What's our role in creation? And the answers that culture gives to these questions creates a framework through which a people's experience of life is filtered. So get your story right, and your culture becomes life-sustaining. Get your story wrong, and your culture becomes self-destructive and destructive of other cultures and a menace to other creatures. Today, we are witnessing how an entire planet and its beauty and its abundance of life that's taken 4 billion years to evolve is being trashed in a geological instant by a global economic machinery that produces vast amounts of products and mountains of waste. Pope Francis made headlines around the globe with a line from paragraph 21 of the Doughnut See, where he writes, "The earth is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth." Herman Daly, one of the founders of Ecological economics, says that the exponential growth of gross domestic product is just as likely to be a measure of ILF, what he calls ILF, as a measure of wealth. It's just as likely to make us ill as it is to make us well and wealthy. ILF and filth. Absurd concentrations of wealth in the midst of mass poverty. Chronic overwork in the midst of forced inactivity. It's a crazy system, but there is indeed a method to its madness. And if we can understand its method, then we can begin to see a way beyond the madness to what the social psychologist Eric Fromm calls the sane society. It was his deep conviction that an entire society can indeed go insane. And when that happens, the most destructive behaviour can appear to be perfectly normal, even logical, according to the internal customs and laws and politics and economic standards of the dysfunctional society. At the core of our economic system is a relentless increase of wealth in the bank accounts of a relatively tiny number of individuals. According to the global data, the richest 1% of the world's population own and control 50%, half of all the world's wealth. Richard Branson went on a tour of the heavens last week in his Virgin Galactic spacecraft, while back on Earth, 1 billion people sifted through the piles of filth in a desperate search for scraps on which to survive, to really survive. Pope Francis writes, "We have never heard and mistreated our common home as much as we have in the last 200 years. And we'll be visiting some of those early scenes of the Industrial Revolution in just a moment. But right now, a really good place to start is in the year 1947 with Paul Samuelson who is regarded as the founding father of modern economics. Paul Samuelson was the first person to draw the economy. It had always been presented in equations, and he was asked to make it understandable to people. So he drew it. He was an engineer by trade. And so he conceived of it as a series of plumbing. Its components consisted of households and business. Households provided labour and capital to business, and in turn, businesses paid wages for labour and profit on the capital. And then with that money going into the household, households would spend, go shopping at businesses, and businesses would provide products and services. And that's it, essentially that's it. That's the neat, self-contained little system. And this drawing was at the heart of Margaret Thatcher's assertion that there is no society. Because as you can see, there is no society. It consists of private households and businesses and what goes on in between. There are, however, leakages from this self-contained system, and because there are leakages, there have to be injections back into it. And those leakages come via the banks, and people earn their money, they save some of it, the banks in turn use some of that, so the theory goes, to invest in new business ventures. There's leaks out to government in terms of tax, government return into society in terms of public spending on public services. And the third element that he put in was international trade, where money is going out of the economy to buy imports, and it's coming back in when people buy exports. And that's it. That's what every economics student meets when they start their economics studies. And it is indelibly ingrained in the brain. And as you can see, it's pared down. It's massively appealing because it makes a lot of sense, but it's also completely awry. I won't go into the details, but many of you will know we need monetary reform because banks don't use deposits to invest in businesses. They're in the business of actually creating money. When you take out a loan, it's not moved from deposits to a loan. It's actually just magicked up out of thin air, and then you pay interest on that. And that's how money is put into the system. And it's put in as interest. And that's what drives the economic growth. Because it's always a debt. It's always a debt-based system. Because money is created as a debt. But we'll get more into that later. So what was missing, of course, has been provided by Kate Raworth, who's really building on the work of Herman Daly. Kate Raworth's trained as an economist, and she walked away from the profession because she could see it offered nothing that was useful in the real world. It was a complete contrast with what she was finding. And then she encountered the work of Herman Daly. And she came back to her profession and has made an enormous contribution. So she's building on Herman Daly. She's building also on Paul Samuelson and filling in the gaps. So we have the households and the market as per Paul Samuelson. She asks the state now, not as a sideshow, but part of the main theatre of economic transactions, and she recognises the commons. And each of these players in the economy provides their own kind of good. So the household provides core goods for the members of the household, without which the economy would fall apart. It's a huge, huge, valuable service being provided by mothers and carers and fathers, providing for the wherewithal for people to actually go out to work and live their lives. The market provides private goods, the state provides public goods, and the commons provide creative or communal goods. And facilitating an exchange around all of these players of the economy is money, financial flows. Now, Kate Raworth recognised, of course, what Paul Samuelson didn't, and that's the economy is embedded in society, that there is such a thing as society. But it doesn't stop there, of course, because it's all embedded within the earth system, which provides all of the living matter and materials, goes into the economy, and then coming out of the economy back into the earth is all the waste matter. So this is the earth as a source of all the matter and energy that is required to run an economy, and the earth as the recipient of all the waste that we put back into the earth. Now, Herman Daly was very clear on something that I think we tend to lose when we think of the circular economy and recycling, and that's the role of energy, which he says is a linear system. It abides by the laws of entropy, the laws of the conservation of energy, so it follows time's arrow. It's always running downhill, and we can't do anything to reverse that. So solar energy comes into the Earth system. It's trapped by photosynthesis, so there's various levels of solar energy, but it's the basic. It is the energy of everything. So it's providing recently stored energy in terms of crops and livestock and forests, wood, but it's providing ancient sunlight energy in the form of fossil fuels as well. And then waste heat goes back into the atmosphere. Of course, fossil fuels increasing greenhouse gases, trapping more of that heat, and then upsetting the equilibrium between the solar energy coming into the Earth system and the energy going back out into outer space, the radiated energy. That's the basis of global warming. So this is the embedded economy, and there's just really one thing that's needing to be amended in this, and that is that it isn't really money that makes the world go round here. It isn't money that makes the world go round. It's actually energy. This is Bill Phillips, who in 1948 actually built Paul Samuelson's model. It's called the MONIAC, Monetary National Income Analog Computer. And what you see there is an actual physical model of Paul Samuelson's diagram. And you see Bill Phillips really intently trained on the pink water. The flow of the water is representing income, tax, spending, and all the rest of it that Paul Samuelson identified. And here's the power of framing to filter out a wider sense of reality. What nobody recognized, what nobody acknowledged, neither Bill Phillips or anybody else, despite their expertise, is that what was making this machine work was completely outside of consciousness. You had to plug it in before it would work and flip a switch. So this is the power of framing. And when we talk about energy, we're talking about different sources of energy. Solar energy is really the original and best. In our ancient days, we always relied on solar energy. In our foraging days, solar energy was the budget. It was the energy budget that we lived on. We also used wood. We used wood to make fires, to cook food. And again, in the ancient days, we did this. And then we discovered we could use water in terms of like water mills, very early part of the Industrial Revolution. Wind, of course, windmills, grinding corn, sailing ships. And then things really took off. And the early part of the Industrial Revolution was entirely fueled really by coal. Coal became the dominant source of energy. And I was really alerted to something that Christine said last night about the days when there was a campaign for coal, not dole. And I'm perhaps maybe speaking out of turn here, I'll speak for myself, but some tension between the role of the coal miners, particularly the conflict in the 80s, and what we now know in terms of the coal industry needing to be closed down and needing to be scaled down. But something that's really, really worth remembering, and this comes out of the work of Timothy Mitchell, who's a professor of political science at the University of Columbia. And it's his thesis that the coal miners were really instrumental in what we today call democracy. And that what happened is that for the first time, workers had their hands on the nodes of power, and that they could unite with the dock workers and the railway workers and close down the energy. They invented the general strike, and this forced the owners to negotiate. So what his thesis is, in a nutshell, is that coal built our democracy and oil set its limits, because oil is a very different source of energy. You don't need large numbers of workers that can mobilize huge bargaining power with owners. It can flow through pipes. You don't have workers working on their own initiative down the mines. You can have overseers and managers to keep a close eye on them. And you don't have large numbers of workers all the way along very concentrated lines of energy. Oil can be routed internationally. And this was done strategically because coal was a real problem for the ruling class, and having concentrated lines of energy that could be closed down for demands for democratic rights. And one of the really untold aspects of the history of the labour movement is that it was much more ambitious than just negotiating pay and conditions. That came later when the unions became part of the management structure. But the early part of the labour movement was much more ambitious. The workers wanted to learn to play musical instruments. They wanted culture. They wanted time for themselves to develop. They wanted to personally grow like we all do. And that was very much part of that early movement. So when we're looking at nuclear energy, it's really important to think about how that it's a highly technical process. You don't need anything like the workforce. So as we move to electricity, and undoubtedly nuclear power is going to be a big part of the electricity mix, the energy mix, then it is going to have a political form. And that reminds me that when we talk about sources of energy, we also talk about forms of power. And for a long time, I've been fascinated by how energy and power are synonyms. That you talk about energy, you talk about power, switching on the power, and you're literally talking about forms of power. And what I mean about that is that we can describe power in different ways. In physics, it's simply a measure of energy transfer. In nature, we talk about the ability to do something, like the power of flight, or an elephant's power of strength, or a human's creative imagination, power of the imagination. And the social power. And if personal power is my ability to do something, then social power is the ability to get other people to act and do something. And that social power comes in two forms. Horizontal social power, i.e. democracy and subsidiarity of decision making, so making decisions at the lowest appropriate level to allow wide participation. But of course, social power can also come in its vertical form, which is power from the top, power from the ruling class downwards to the bottom of society. And the classic example of that is the pyramid of power, where you have the ruling class at the top and you have the slaves at the bottom. And today, those are the wage slaves created by the Industrial Revolution. And when I say created by the Industrial Revolution, I really mean it was strategically created by the ruling class, because nobody would want to work in conditions like this. This is a metalworking factory. And I just want to point out one of the details. If you look at this picture, you can see a couple of people having a few moments to themselves. Often people have to clean the machines in their break. Look at this man here, gazing into space, traumatized. We should be in no doubt at the violence that's going on here. We should be in no doubt that this is actually a battle scene, a war scene. There is class war going on here because these people that are working here, they don't want to be there. They've been forced into factories by being deprived of their subsistence and their ability to fend for themselves and to look after themselves and have communal decision making and not ruled over by, we see here, a proprietary gaze, the factory with arms, hands behind the back, while people are toiling. And from the public record, we come across, this is from an agricultural report by Lord John Bishop in 1794. The use of common lands operates on the mind in a sort of independence. After enclosure, subordination of the lower ranks, which in the present time is so much wanted, will be considerably secured. Another example from agriculturalist Arthur Young in 1771, everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor or they will never be industrious. This follower of Christ says it is only hunger which can spur and goad them on to labour. Hunger will tame the fiercest animals. It will teach decency and civility, obedience and subjugation. And you can see a real concern with subjugation here, a real concern to have power and control over what are considered to be the lower ranks. And this should be a reminder here, as indeed the next one from a Quaker businessman, that there is a difference between our professed religion and our practiced religion. John Mellors says, our forests and great commons make the poor that are upon them too much like Indians. They are a hindrance to industry and are nurseries of idleness and insolence. And this reference to the Indians is a reminder that what we're talking about when we talk about enclosure is an internal form of colonialism. It's actually domestic colonialism. And colonialism is overseas enclosure. And it's still happening today, as indigenous peoples are pushed off their lands. So we've talked about sources of energy and forms of power. And this was from a presentation I did some time ago on the powers and principalities. And you can see that the power structure is much more complex nowadays. There's these nested overlapping interests. But the point, I won't go into all of these parts of the power structure, but the point is that underneath it all is still a vertical power structure with now financial interests at the top and the labour still at the bottom, from which wealth and value is extracted. So, with financial power now at the top of the structure of power, what are we talking about? How does capitalism work? Why would you have financial power at the commanding heights of the power structure? This illustration is really to show some of the deeper workings of capitalism. So what we have here, C1, is a commodity. For example, a market gardener produces a box of apples, goes to the market, sells it for money, and buys something useful, maybe a wheelbarrow or a step ladder, which is commodity number 2. So you have an economy that revolves around useful things and doing things, and money is the medium that can facilitate a use economy with people doing things usefully. And this is the kind of image that we might have in mind when we think about capitalism. But it isn't actually anything to do with capitalism. It's a market, but markets are thousands of years old. So what are we talking about when we talk about capitalism? We're talking about one thing primarily, which is making a profit. So really the governing role of the capitalist system. So you start with your money, you buy or you produce a commodity, and you do it in order to make more money. It's almost like common sense, why would you ever question it? And the plus sign is the increased quantity of the money. But this is where things get really interesting, because we have our money, we produce a commodity, we sell the commodity at a profit, and we increase our store of money. But we're not satisfied with doing that. You could say that this is the logic of a small business and a family business, and it's really important to make a distinction between the legitimate use of this logic for small businesses and what corporate business engages in, which is not to use that increased quantity to take the children to the theatre, pay your workers, pay for the stocks that you use in your business, and get by and be content with that quantity of increase. what a capitalist will do with that increase is actually increase the size of their business, increase the commodity production, so they're investing their profits in expanded production, which in turn will increase their profit. And with that increased profit, they will increase production. With that increased production, they will make more profit. And this goes on ostensibly forever. It's unlimited. It's a continual expansion of profit, investment in more commodity production, and then more profit. And then it gets even more extreme because investors are not interested in the commodities at all. They're only interested in a return on their money. And that's what's signified here with the increase. And this is a compound interest increase as well. So if you imagine a bank giving you a loan, then one of the reasons that the bank, well, the main reason that business is having to expand and expand all the time is because it's subject to compound interest that is expected to be paid back. So what this is doing is it's driving unlimited economic growth. And on this scale, I've got it doesn't matter what the unit is, it's just increasing up there, that side, and it's decreasing down to that side. And remember what Herman Daly says, which is that economic growth can be just as much a measure of health as a measure of wealth. So we have our financial capital growing, as it's meant to do in order to be able to survive as a business. What you're doing is you're drawing down natural capital. And I've purposely mirrored it to raise the question is of whether we've actually increased our capital at all when we include what are called externalities, because natural capital is a free-for-all. But it gets worse than that because there is also social capital. And as we saw from those early scenes where you have workers being pitted to just struggle to survive, and that there's no longer, the relationships are being replaced by transactions and competition, that the social capital is also taking a big hit. But it also gets worse than that because as financial capital increases, it's subject to what economists call diminishing marginal utility, which means the more that you have of something, the less satisfaction you get from having it. Your first piece of cake is absolutely delicious. Your second piece of cake, and you've had enough, you're satisfied. But it gets worse than that, because beyond a certain threshold, there's what's called negative marginal utility, which is counterproductive. So that third piece of cake, you wish you hadn't had it, it's left you feeling sick. So as Herman Daly says, that it can be just as much a measure of health as a measure of wealth, and this is what he's talking about. We've all been introduced on a huge level to systems thinking with flatten the curve, if you remember the slogan that was used for stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. And there was a very good reason for this, of course, which is to protect the healthcare system, which could only run at a certain capacity. So people had to be able, the system had to be able to limit the numbers of people going through the system by all the protective measures that we are practicing today. And what's often missed about this diagram is that it's the same volume that's going through the system. It's just being drawn out over a longer period of time. And this reminds us that a good life-sustaining economy is about slowing down. It's about slowing down the throughput of material energy. It's the same, it can be the same volume, but it's actually being extended over a longer period of time. And of course, we can easily replace that with a planetary boundary. And then we can see that there are actually lots of curves that we need to flatten. Lots of these curves, these exponential growth curves from the 1950s onwards. I don't know if you can see it, they're quite small, but these hockey sticks the dramatic increase in all of them takes place in the 1950s onwards. And we have, if you can't see them, we have things like shrimp, aquaculture, coastal nitrogen, primary energy use, fertilizer consumption, methane, international tourism, real GDP. All of these taking off in the 1950s, and all interactive as well. So, for example, obviously, the massive increase in carbon dioxide in the 1950s onwards having an effect on coastal acidification, dissolved in seawater, fertilizer consumption, creating coastal nitrogen, which flows out to sea, and is causing huge dead zones around the coast, which is where all the fish need to reproduce. So they're all interactive, and there's called positive feedback loops, because of course they're reinforcing effects. So we have a real problem if we're going to keep growing. And in April, Joe Biden hosted a virtual climate summit amongst 40 world leaders, and Boris Johnson, who is chairing the UK head looking to COP26, is really going to be in a leading role. So what Boris Johnson has to say is really important. And I won't comment just yet, but I want you to hear what Boris Johnson is going to be offering, undoubtedly, at COP26, and the line of argument that's going to be taken.
It's vital for all of us to show that this is not all about some expensive, politically correct green act of money hugging, or how do you want to put it? I'm going with money hugging, right? You know where I'm driving at, friends and colleagues. This is about growth and jobs, and I think the President was absolutely right to stress that. And I want to leave you with the thought that we can build back better from this pandemic by building back greener. And don't forget that the UK will be able to cut our own CO2 emissions by about 42% on 1990 levels, and we've seen our economy grow by 73%. You can do both at once. Cake, have, eat is my message to you.
Cake, have, eat. We can grow our economy and reduce emissions. But can we? Is that a credible assertion? What we would need to see, if there was any empirical grounding for what Boris Johnson is saying here, and one thing that I would urge you to be very, very focused on with going into COP26 is, does anybody talk about material consumption, or is it all going to be about energy? Because it's a very much more difficult proposition when we're talking about material consumption. And when we're talking about material consumption, we're talking about embedded energy. And therein lies a problem with what Boris Johnson's saying, when he quite correctly says the economy has grown and emissions have decreased. But that decrease does not account for embodied energy. And if you think about manufacturing in this country, it's been outsourced to a large degree, especially since the 1990s. We've probably seen a 42% decrease in manufacturing in this country since the 1990s. So we're going to see a 42% decrease in carbon emissions. So we need to keep an eye on material consumption. So I'm going to run the data now. What we want to see to give us hope is GDP and raw material consumption diverging. We want to see GDP growing, and we want to see raw consumption maybe not decreasing, but not growing as fast. This is the data. You can see the problem. And it's even more stark than that, because from 2008 onwards, we see material consumption actually going ahead of GDP. And it's my guess that what's happening there is we're building back better. Better meaning more. And that following the 2008 financial crash, there's this extra impetus to get the economy going again because we've lost 2 years of growth. That is considered a crash, even though one of the stark, astonishing pieces of data that this is revealing is that from the early 90s until 25 years later, the UK economy has doubled from £1 trillion to £2.1 trillion. Material consumption has doubled in 25 years. Material consumption comes with a heavy energy cost embedded within it. And here we're seeing energy going ahead. We're seeing embodied energy going ahead of GDP. So what about the global material footprint? We're seeing all of the materials that are used in an economy that have been recorded, fossil fuels, biomass, non-metallic materials, that's things like sand, gravel, stone, cement, all used in construction, and metal ores used in technology particularly, and building construction as well. So the global footprint, not surprising, is increasing between 1970 and 2015. It's actually trebled between 1970 and 2015. So that what we need to know in order to really understand what's going on here is what is a sustainable level of material consumption. And the sustainable level, according to Earth system science, that looks at what we can afford to extract from the economy in terms of material inputs to the economy, is about 50 billion. So we can see that we exceeded that in the late 1990s. And I checked the consumption for 2020, and it's actually 100.6 billion tonnes. In other words, we're using twice the planet. We would need 2 planets to supply our present material consumption. So, green growth, question mark. When we look back at our iconic growth in GDP, what Boris Johnson is actually talking about when he says a 42% decrease in in carbon emissions set against GDP. He's talking about, if we give him the benefit of the doubt, and we say not all of that was about overseas manufacturing, shifting manufacturing overseas. Let's give him some benefit of the doubt and say some of it was achieved through efficiency gains. Then what we see is a relative decoupling. We can see that emissions are growing, but they're not growing as fast as GDP. There's some hope there. But Boris Johnson is actually saying something better than that, because he's saying we've been able to reduce our emissions at the same time as our economy is growing. So what he's talking about is this second scenario of absolute decoupling. So let's say we have achieved absolute decoupling between carbon emissions and GDP growth. Is that enough? Well, it isn't, because it's still above what we now know are the planetary boundaries. So what we need to achieve, and this has been left out of the picture at the moment, and it's the time factor. And really we're talking about a very narrow, tiny window of opportunity. It's really now or never. It's really about achieving a dramatic transformation within a carbon budget of 420 billion tonnes of carbon emissions. That's how the IPCC thinking is that we're emitting about 55 billion tonnes of carbon a year, and we have a carbon budget of 420 billion tonnes, and then we need to be achieving net zero after that. We need to use that carbon budget to transform our economy. And if you think about that, we're using 55 billion tonnes a year, and we've got a carbon budget of 420 billion tonnes. Then by 2028, we need to have gone through a complete transformation. So it's a very tiny window of opportunity. Would you want to grow your economy and risk not being able to achieve that target? I think it's madness to play with something that has absolutely no empirical grounding. If we're going to grow our economy, then we better make sure that we do this path, we follow this path of sufficient absolute decoupling. That means a very dramatic, sudden drop in our carbon emissions. It's for a very good reason that people talk about putting our economy on a war footing. I really don't like the metaphor of a war because, in my opinion, we've been waging a 500-year war. Capitalism has been waging a 500-year war against the earth. And we need to make peace with the earth. But the metaphor is meant to be how, when the Second World War broke out, there was an overnight dramatic retooling of industry. And there was no holds barred. And really that's what we need to be seeing now. Again, with COP26, let's see if we see that. So exponential growth is what we're having to contend with here. And there is no empirical grounding for what Boris Johnson is saying in terms of we can grow our economy and reduce our carbon emissions because of our material consumption and because we have no evidence yet that we've been able to take proper account of our proper energy, our full energy use, and achieve a decoupled, absolute, sufficient decoupling. So what systems theory, when we turn to Earth system science, what it can give us is some of that empirical grounding that we desperately need. And the classic example is what I'm going to show now, and it's rabbits in a meadow. It's pared down to rabbits in a meadow. So we see the population of rabbits increasing along this line, and it's over time. When we run the modelling, and K stands for system capacity, so it's the ability of the meadow to sustain the population of rabbits. And you can easily translate this into energy use and GDP. And that's really the point of this. If you think of this growth in GDP, this is the planetary boundary. And so in this scenario, we reach what is called equilibrium, which means there's an optimum level of the rabbit population living in the meadow. This is really a good, this is the sweet spot of rabbit living. This was probably where we were at in the 1970s, when we first learned about the limits to growth. We had an opportunity then. We had an opportunity to dramatically retool the economy and change direction. And the world moves in that direction. We think about limits to growth. I think about Jimmy Carter appearing before the nation in his woolly cardigan with a wind turbine in the White House. It's astonishing to think that was 50 years ago. But of course, the neoliberal agenda happened after that, and that was completely ditched, because we were stoking the economy after that. So we lost that opportunity in the 1970s. So Boris Johnson has really, I think, disavowed this second scenario, which is that we've discovered that we're overshooting our boundary. We need to reduce our consumption, but Boris Johnson is saying, no, we can continue to grow. And so this second scenario represents really a situation that's politically unacceptable, which is that we would purposely reduce our growth in order to allow the planet to heal. And we would find, we would negotiate, Kate Raworth talks about the plane taking off with no landing gear, but we took off on this GDP growth curve, and it's like taking off in an airplane with no wheels, no landing gear. You wouldn't do it. So this situation is what I think is what Boris Johnson is rejecting. He's rejecting that we carefully calibrate material consumption against planetary boundaries. And so Earth system science in this situation says that would be excess and oscillation. So this has been rejected. So there's a third scenario that system science shows us. When we reject that nuance of actually measuring and adjusting, facilitating our relationship with the natural world, and it is, of course, excess and collapse. And there's obviously a very, very real, stark possibility of this happening. Particularly as it looks like we're going to be forced into continual growth. And I'll say a bit more about that. Well, basically what that means is that we have to take the initiative there. It means that the national policy will be for growth, but there's simply downsizing. I'll go through lots of the things that we can do. So coming to Kate Raworth, and she redraws the economy in this way. So what Boris Johnson is really talking about, so I think about the words of Henry David Thoreau, who says that, he talks about improved means for unimproved ends. What Kate Raworth is presenting here is improved ends, setting a goal for our economy. Instead of being run by our economy, we run the economy. And the point about setting a social foundation is that nobody should fall below a certain level of called critical human deprivations. We also have to protect planetary boundaries, and if we exceed them, then of course we're degrading the planet. And between these two is the safe and just place for humanity. So what are the social foundations? What are the ingredients of the social foundations? I think you will know these because they're the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll just run through them quickly because I'm amazed at how quickly the time has gone. So you'll be aware of all of these, and I'll come back to these in a moment. And the environmental ceiling, composed of 9 planetary boundaries, identified by Earth system scientists, climate change, of course, novel entities is chemical pollution, industrial pollution, stratospheric ozone depletion, the ozone layer, atmospheric aerosol loading is a technical word for air pollution, ocean acidification. Biochemical flows means intensive farming, particularly overuse of nitrogen, freshwater use, land system change. Land system change is a really important one because if you recall those scenes from the early Industrial Revolution and the enclosure, what we were talking about with enclosure really is land system change. We're talking about the use of previous common lands for now privatised use and intensive farming. And of course, tragically, biodiversity loss, which is between 1,000 and 10,000 times the normal background extinction rate that we would expect to see. And in between all these identified boundaries is the safe space for humanity. So Kate Raworth calls this our planetary selfie. This is the social foundation. And all the red you can see is numbers of human beings falling through the floor. And you can see that it's like a sore rash. It's a dismal situation, and we know some of those figures. We know at least 800 million people are malnourished. We know that a third of the world's population lack sanitation. And whilst this is happening, we're still breaking planetary boundaries. We're still exceeding planetary boundaries, which will make it impossible to prevent people falling through the floor. We need to heal these boundaries. We need to bring our economy back within these boundaries. So this is really, our system of Earth is not very well at all. So this last 5 minutes, I want to introduce you, if you haven't come across him already, it's the work of Crawford Stanley Hollins, who's one of the founders of ecological economics. He lived from 1930 to 2019. And what you see here, these 4 rectangular boxes, are 4 parts of a cycle. And they're connected by a Mobius loop. And it starts down the bottom left-hand corner, which is the phase of growth. So you see growth, and this could be anything. This could be, let's say this is GDP. So you see GDP growing, reaching what is called conservation. So this is really the point of equilibrium. This is the point of exhaustion. K stands for system capacity. So we're seeing growth and maturity. And then the omega point here is about collapse. or in this instance, language that's being used is released, because we've reached the point of maximum consumption with our GDP. And as we're seeing now, we're seeing a controlled reduction. There's been a 9.9% reduction in GDP in 2020 in the UK economy. It's a wonderful achievement, and it was planned. And it hasn't, well, I will be careful here. It's been possible for us because we're a very, very wealthy nation. We're not sharing our wealth very much, but we do have the power, and we have the resources, and it's kept us relatively safe compared to other nations that don't have the resources that we have. So when we've gone through this, and we're going through this, and let's be real, on a global scale, we're doing very, very well. We're very comfortable on it with this. And this is called the for loop. And it's a long, slower process. So think from the 1950s, GDP growing, and then very quickly, overnight, we've seen an organised collapse, closing down economies, shutting borders. And this phase that is on the back loop, and we've seen this same with the pandemic, we've seen this collapse, the economy purposely collapsed, and then a rapid reorganisation, remarkable mobilisation of power and resources. Never again can it be said that there is no alternative. We've seen an incredible achievement. We mustn't forget that. It's the lid has been lifted on what we can do when we have the will, the political will to make changes. And now we reach a critical junction. And it's marked by this yellow arrow. And we're at this point now. We're at this point of going one of two ways. We can either go back round harmoniously, back round to a new stage of exploitation. And I will put it to you, friends, that this is what we're seeing. That green growth is a euphemism for a new round of capital accumulation. And that green growth really means big opportunity for making huge profits. And we need to be careful about that. We need to be insisting on including material consumption and putting in capital material consumption if we're serious about responding to the emergency that we're in. And that will be represented by this exit point here, which is about alternatives. It's about leaving this infinite cycle. Einstein defined madness as the doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And what we're about to do is do the same thing again. The same thing we did after the financial crash. What did we do with huge sums of public money? We bailed out the banks. What are we going to do with huge sums of money now? We're going to put it into private hands. What we need to be doing really is that on the screen. It says degrowth. It's about, degrowth is not about reducing GDP. It's a positive move. It's about reducing material and energy consumption, and then GDP will follow. GDP will fall. But it won't be a crash or a recession or a panic, or all those metaphors that are used when an economy slows down. Because we're purposely doing it, as we're doing it now, purposely slowing the economy down. And we're using protective measures. Protectionism is, it's no longer a dirty word at the moment. We're all taking great care to protect ourselves, to protect others. We can continue doing that. This is about, it says it's to end planned obsolescence. So again, what we have at the moment is it's actually happened to my computer. There's a little tiny part in it that I can't get repaired. It means my keyboard doesn't work, which is why I'm using this. So I've got a choice. Do I buy a new computer or do I just make do? I'm trying to make do. So we would bring that to an end. We would build things properly engineered, proper parts, not little plastic cogs that are going to wear out. So we would shift from ownership to usership, as we saw with the example of a user economy, where we could barter useful things, or we could have shared washing machines. We could have a washing machine, you can have a house or an aspect of the street that has all the things that you, maybe garden tools, things that you don't need to own yourself, that you could just do occasionally. So it's a usership economy, not an ownership economy. Ending food waste. It's astonishing that we throw away, it's a third to a half of all food. The economist Jason Tickle has estimated how much land we could spare if we didn't throw any food away. And it comes to the figure of 11 million square miles. So if that third to a half of food was not thrown away, but was eaten, allowing us to reduce the amount of food that we would have to produce in the first place. 11 million square miles is the size of North America, Canada, and China combined. Imagine turning that to nature. Imagine rewilding on that scale. And E.O. Wilson says, he talks about half Earth. We're one species. Half of the Earth is fine for us. It's like the 1%, the richest 1% who have half of all wealth. We're one species. At the present, we have about 70% of the material output of the planet. We commandeer about 70% of the planet for our own use, and the 5 to 30 million other species have to get by on the remainder. So if we end food waste, there's a very simple equation here, which is we need to decarbonise our economy and recarbonise the natural world. But it's actually more nuanced than that, because we don't recarbonise the natural world. All we need to do to allow nature to heal is to stop destroying nature. Nature has enormous capacities to regenerate and heal. All we have to do is take the pressure off and stop destroying. So scaling down ecologically destructive industries, we can have fun with this. I can think of 5. I can think of needing to descale the carbon industry, the intensive farming, particularly beef. Let's do away with the arms industry. That's the use of the arms industry. Let's definitely ban wildlife trade. And a 5th one, maybe you can think of a 5th one that you'd like to see go. But these are all things that we could do if we could engage in democratic decision making, take control of our economy. And with this expanded production that automation is making available, let's shorten the working week. Let's have a job guarantee. We've got chronic overwork in the midst of forced inactivity. Let's share that time. Let's take the pressure off people who are having to work too hard. And of course, fundamental really to all of this is universal basic income, which is about the most reliable way of distributing wealth, really. And that's on the basis that we could provide a universal basic income and not call it reparations. Let's not call it the massive wealth and value that's been created over 150 years of blood, sweat and tears, hard work that's been grafted into the system by workers. Let's not call it reparations. Again, I think of Jason Tickle, who has done some calculations on the value of the black Africans to the American economy. So during the slave trade, 15 million African Americans were shipped to North America and British colonies. And he's estimated the value of that. If those workers, if those slaves had been paid at the minimum wage in America today, and it had earned a modest interest, then the African Americans have provided $97 trillion of value to the American economy. 4 times the American economy. The British expropriated 45 trillion, the equivalent of $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. So when we're talking about an ecological debt, we're also talking about massive economic debt, actually, in terms of work and labour. And so let's not call it reparations, although they are. Well, let's call that universal basic income. So I'm going to close it there after one more suggestion that I've made, which is to cap income ratios. And I will just very quickly mention this because it's a really elegant solution to the massive, historic, unprecedented pay gap between CEOs and the bottom paid workers in a corporation, which is something like 500 times that assumption. So let's have a ratio cap at 10 times. So a CEO can only be paid 10 times more than the lowest paid worker. And you will see overnight all bars stop, all bars ended. You will see CEOs wanting to pay their workers as much as possible. And knowing that they will get 10 times more. Thank you very much for